morning, everybody. I'm Gary Wayne, founder of A1 Solutions International, where we work with founders, leadership teams, financial businesses to improve efficiency, scale intelligently, and grow through smarter use of technology, systems, and operational strategy. Today's episode is titled Manufacturing Affordability, Building a Scalable Housing System Without Subsidy. Now, this is a very different conversation. Most discussions around housing focus on shortages, pricing, and government intervention. What we're talking about today is something more structural, a system designed to produce affordability at scale, commercially viable, and without relying on ongoing subsidies. I'm joined by Mike Labbe from Home Opportunities, who has been working on this problem since 1979 and has built what is now referred to as a non-market housing model. Structure that combines development, finance, and social enterprise into a self-sustaining engine. It's really good to have you here. I've been looking forward to this conversation. How are you today?
I'm doing just fine. You know, we've got 10-degree weather over here in Toronto, so it's not quite my running weather, but it's good enough.
You do a lot of running, yeah?
At least 10 to 15K a week just to keep the old heart going.
Yeah, I wish I could run, actually. I have to walk. But I do work out in the gym. Anyway,
I
enough of
recommend
that.
Swimming is good for you.
Yeah, it's all about time, I think.
Yeah.
So anyway, listen, you've been working on housing for over 4 decades. What originally pulled you into solving this problem?
Yeah, I graduated back in the 70s out of in urban and regional planning, and I had a competency in the development area, but I did not like the power relationship between developers and purchasers. So I turned instead towards environmental planning. Then I ran into organizations that were nonprofit development entities that worked on behalf of the end users of the units, and that fit my philosophy quite nicely because now I'm doing development on behalf of the end occupants of units. And so that's where I started. I started in a space that had government subsidies, and 12 years in, government cut off the funding and all of my friends went to look for work elsewhere, and I switched from subsidized rental over to ownership and discovered that I didn't need subsidies, therefore I wasn't beholden to government, therefore I could figure things out on my own without having to constantly fit within government programs.
So you describe your organisation as a social enterprise. What does that mean in real terms?
Yeah, so broadly the definition of social enterprise is any enterprise, profit-making or non-profit, that operates for the purposes of making society better, and I often add protecting the planet. I fit into the non-profit side of that definition. Home Opportunities is a non-profit development and marketing consulting firm that consults to groups of purchasers who form a cooperative corporation that becomes our client, and we build condominium homes for them. Sometimes called strata title. And I'm not even sure exactly what the term is in England, but it's the title that allows you to own a piece of air and still be able to get a mortgage.
So what is the difference between social housing and non-market housing?
Yes, social housing is housing subsidized by the government that is almost exclusively rental in nature. Sometimes it aims at extremely low incomes and ghettoizes people into those buildings. That is less common these days as people realize the disadvantage of that kind of social structure. Non-market housing is housing that is designed for the benefit of society, but still works in partnership with the private sector. Invariably, nonprofits deliver non-market housing so that they can control the profit margins to still work for the private sector, but not to become exorbitant. One of the difficulties we have is when the interest rates dropped, prices went through the roof because everybody needed to maximize the returns. And that's not just developers, that's unions, that's suppliers, that's government. Everybody jumped on the bandwagon. Then when the interest rates went up, they were all stuck where they'd put themselves and the market simply shut down. So non-market housing looks at housing from the affordability perspective first, negotiates appropriate profit margins, so it's still good work for the private sector, but then focuses on reaching very low income end users through financing mechanisms primarily.
What cycle are we in now? Obviously, interest rates came down. They're steady. The Fed didn't change their rates, yesterday or the day before. But there is a hawkish, air coming back in with the geopolitical situation. How is that affecting your market?
Yes, now remember, the markets will be somewhat different, and I'm not conversant with the UK market, but in Canada, the interest rates have not come back down far enough to restart the market. So for instance, this year is the first year in 20 years where not a single condominium development launched. In Canada, you have to get 70% pre-sales to be able to get your financing to move forward with development. The trouble is that in most cases, you're dealing with 50% of the 70% being investors. Investors will only enter a pre-sale market if they're guaranteed in their minds that the market will go up and they'll make money. So that with the investors gone from the market is dead. Our group of purchasers varies from minimum wage all the way up to 100,000 Canadian dollars a year. And in that market, there's an infinite number of buyers. So we're able to pre-sell despite the market conditions.
You said not one condominium that had been launched, and you also said Canadian rates had not come down. How geared are Canadian rates then to the US and the UK and Europe? I mean, why the distinction? I don't understand. I hear a lot about Canada and, great country, but it seems to be sort of stuck in a little bit of a, like a non-movement type of zone.
Well, the lack of sales also is being experienced by the States as well. There's a difference in mortgage situations between the two countries. Can't speak for the UK. In America, virtually all homes are purchased with 30-year money. So you get a mortgage, you get the interest rate, and it's good for the next 30 years. They're now paying over 6% for that, and that's causing quite a bit of grief. In Canada, the most common mortgage term is 5 years. The amortization might be 30 years, but the term is 5 years, so the interest rates roll over every 5 years. That kind of interest rate is at 5%. So you're accepting a risk for a lower interest rate compared to the States, but the effect is the same. Because that regime has been in place for both countries, the rate has to come down to probably 3% in Canada and 5% in the States for the market to restart.
When we spoke, you said your model, and I might be wrong, balances profit and social benefit. How
Correct.
do you maintain that balance in practice?
Yes, so we act as the development agency on behalf of our future owners of our condominiums. So we negotiate with the private sector. So we don't work with developers, we work with contractors. And the contractors we work with agree to a 10% margin. And a 10% margin is not bad for a contractor, especially if they get to set the price when you start construction, and especially if they're competent contractors, they can set a budget and maintain it for the life of the project. So that's an example. We work with our real estate process works to keep the cost of marketing and sales under $2,000 a unit, which is compared to $20,000 a unit when you're selling in the open market. We sell to what are called affinity groups. So we work with groups of people, say an employer that's having trouble keeping their employees because they can't afford the housing in the area. We will go to their HR department and offer the chance to purchase to their employees. So rather than going to the market at large, we focus on economic development within the communities we're in by focusing on those industries that are trying to attract workers.
And talking about affordability, you said you had a framework that rested on four pillars: non-profit delivery mechanism, no reliance on grants or subsidies, ownership over rental, scalable production. Can you walk us through how these actually all work together?
Yes, quite happily so. The first one we've really now discussed. The nonprofit controls the relationship to the private sector to the benefit of the affordability of the project. Because obviously our client is the end user, they want it to be affordable. No grants and subsidies means that we have to move over to the ownership side, because you can develop an ownership model that resells into the marketplace so you can recover the money you need to make it affordable, and therefore it's a loan, not a grant and subsidy. So we turn the grants and subsidies into loans. The reason behind that is no country is rich enough to have sufficient grants and subsidies to solve the problem. So here in Toronto, to give you an example, Toronto needs 10,000 units a year of affordable housing in order to tread water. Not to fix its $300,000 backlog of affordable housing, but just to tread water, stay in the same place. With all of the money that they can raise in the best political environment that they've had, they can only generate 3,000 units. So there's another 7,000 that's needed by somebody who doesn't need those grants and subsidies. By borrowing the grants and subsidies, so for instance, we have charges that the municipality charges against the units to cover off-site development expenses. They're called development charges here. If you don't pay the development charges, which we don't have to as a nonprofit, then taxes go up and we won't be very popular. If you agree to pay back the development charges when the units resell, then the money comes out of their reserve account and the taxes don't have to go up. So from a tactical point of view, you can then get to the 10,000 without taxes going up, and you're not using grants and subsidies. And when you reach 10,000 units a year, you don't care how long they last, because you're satisfying the need, you're treading water. And so it's a change in philosophy that allows you to start thinking about how do we increase production in order to satisfy the need. And if we satisfy the need, we don't have to keep talking about this long-term affordability issue, which is a big deal here in Canada and undermines our ability to solve the problem. So that's why ownership. Now, we have sources of money, and you also have sources of money in the UK that are called shared equity mortgages. So the development charges, the land sometimes, direct loans are all lent to the project to be paid back when people sell. So we are selling, so this is the third point, we are selling our units at market. So let's say, I'm never going to use pounds, but feel free to put pounds in, $600,000 for a unit, but the mortgage you carry is $300,000. But you only make money on $300,000 on your unit. The other $300,000 shares in your appreciation, and we pay back that money when you sell. So we create ownership that is affordable because your carrying costs have been reduced, but we protect the money to do that by selling it to you at full market value. So it's a nice balancing act of what's going on in the marketplace. Is you don't get a windfall, but you get a chance to own at what would normally be rental monthly costs, which is very attractive to a lot. We allow a small number of units, 3%, to be available to people on minimum wage, which is absolutely unheard of. But if you're 20 years old, working a job near minimum wage and you can own, that starts your life on a trajectory that's completely different than if you're a tenant for 20 years before you can own. So we're trying to transform people's life experiences, including single parents, etc., by giving them a chance to become homeowners. Then we get to the last piece, the fourth pillar, which is we have to double the capacity of our construction industry. And there is so much retirement going on in the trades that we're barely able to keep up with the retirement. So the way to double the capacity of the construction industry is to start building 50% of our housing in factories, something that Europe is much more used to. We have virtually no factory production involved in our housing, whereas in Europe you often are close to the 50%. So to some degree, if you need to increase the capacity of your construction industry, you're going to have to get even more aggressively involved with factory production because it's easier to train factory workers than it is to train on-site tradesmen. So those are the 4 pillars. With those 4 pillars, you can basically build enough housing and deliver it to address the housing needs of any country. It's also worth noting that the most significant economic development opportunity for any country in the world, and I've been to 22, is the ability to meet their housing needs. In Canada, we need an extra 200,000 units a year of affordable housing. That represents 300,000 jobs. That eliminates the mess that our friends to the south have created with tariffs. We would completely make the tariff situation go away by building enough affordable housing to provide jobs for those factory workers that now are having trouble with the tariff situation.
Just tell me, from a business point of view or company point of view, how do you raise enough money or accumulate enough money to cover all the projects?
Yes, so it's on a project by project basis. What is fortunate for us is we have multiple sources that we can go to on each given project. I actually sat down and figured them out, and we have 165% of the financing that we need in general. So we can pick and choose which sources we go to related to specific projects. But be aware that the rate of return is either traditional rates of return on the funds that goes out in the way of mortgages. We can get that money from banks, from credit unions. Right now we've got sources of government lending that comes in as part of the syndication, gives confidence to the rest of the money. Then we have a list of loans that can come in to be paid back later, and a shared equity mortgage appreciates at the rate of the marketplace. And now that we're at the bottom of the marketplace, it's a good place for pension plans, insurance companies, long-term investors to come in, put their money in. They're guaranteed to be able to take it out within 15 years, and they get the market rate of return. That source of money is extremely large once you have the confidence, which we're creating through government investment, to be able to go there. So there's almost an infinite amount of that kind of money once they're confident that the market is stable. Beyond that, we go to government sources like the development charges, like paying for the land when people sell, like the fees that are charged being paid when people sell. So there's a number of sources that we go to, but in Canada there's several governments that actually offered shared equity lending. And that shared equity lending is the last piece that we need to reach our 50% carrying costs that we're targeting. So it's all about putting together a complicated capital stack, which we can do because we've been doing it for the last 30 years.
Well, what's your geography?
The city I'm in, which is Toronto, feels a lot like a smaller London. Having been to London a few times, it's quite interesting, very cosmopolitan like London is. A little less of a segregated neighborhoods that you have. We don't have segregated neighborhoods to that extent. We're segregated by income, not by color. But in some cases, I notice color segregation in London. But beyond that, the cities feel very, very similar. You've got better looking transit vehicles.
Are you concentrating though on Toronto, or are you moving further afield?
No, this model fortunately works in small centers, 20,000 and up, as well as big centers. In Southern Ontario, there's 5,000 empty jobs that they can't fill across the entirety of Southern Ontario because of the lack of affordable housing. So every municipality now understands that the most important feature for their economic development is housing that people can afford. When we had COVID, the high prices of the city spread out into the countryside as people escaped from the city when they could work virtually. And with that higher prices created the problem of low-income workers having nowhere they could live close to where they wanted to work.
But where do most shared equity structures go wrong?
The most common mistake, we negotiate the shared equity returns. Those are exactly the market rate of returns. If it's set up by financial institutions, they will take some of the equity growth from the purchasers that rightfully belong to them and make it far less attractive. So instead of accepting rates of return that are exactly proportionate to the increase in the market, they take 50% of the purchaser's equity return, which works out really well for them, but then why is the purchaser in they paying for a mortgage when they get such a low rate of return? So that kind of shared equity can't grow as fast because it's not as attractive. But shared equity that's fair can grow quite significantly, and from most rates of return, if you could guarantee that the market would stay reasonable, then the market return is fine. Now, when you get to the bottom of a market, a smart investor goes in now because, of course, there's going to be some accelerated growth as we go back up to unreasonable prices once again. You know, these cycles, I've been through 5 in my career, and they're very clear. The longer the good cycle lasts, the longer the bad cycle lasts. And so we're in a bad cycle that's probably another 6 years long.
Huh. You moved away from long-term subsidised affordability towards volume production, of ownership. Why is that shift so important?
Well, from a policy point of view, it's important to know in Canada, and I suspect to some degree in the UK, it's less expensive to build and operate a unit as an ownership unit than a rental unit, as long as the units are identical. And the reason for that is that in an ownership unit, people take care of the inside of their suites. That you get that for free as a volunteer effort. Whereas in a rental, you have to send a paid person in to fix washers, to repaint, to do a whole bunch of things that would be done by the owners. In an ownership situation, the owner brings a down payment. That reduces the carrying costs, makes it more affordable for a lower income person. The maintenance costs in general are less because people care about their units. So that's a policy advantage. The next policy advantage, which is incredibly valuable, is if you have an ownership situation where you share in the return on the portion of the home that you carry, you're going to make an effort to be incredibly honest about how much you can carry, because the more you carry, the more money you make for yourself. So there's a built-in incentive to honesty. If you're in a subsidized rental unit, there's a built-in incentive to hide income so you pay as low a rent as possible. So on a policy basis, would you prefer a policy that supports honesty or dishonesty? And so the ownership side supports honesty, which then means that the public purse is less exposed to the amount of lending that they have to do to that process. And we've designed the model so that if you're a single mom with, say, 2 kids, you move into a 2-bedroom, and you're carrying half the cost of your home and you get married, now you've got twice the income. You don't have to leave your home. You can pay off that money so that you own more of your home, make more money, and voluntarily pass the money on to someone else. So it's a really solid pay-it-forward system where people benefit from paying it forward.
Could they eventually take over 100% of the property?
Of course, that's the desire and expectation for people to do, because the sooner you do that, the sooner we have money to help the next person.
You mentioned that the salary range is 33 grand to 100, 110. Why that particular range? I know obviously that's quite low, but what happens, at the 150 level?
So what we're doing, because the beauty of no grants and subsidies is we're not afraid of 2,000, 3,000 unit projects. If you're going to do a 3,000 unit project, you have to have blended incomes. So what we do is we start at 35,000 for just 3% of the units. Then we go up to under 50,000 for 20% of the units. Then we go under 70,000 for 20%. Then we go under 90. So 80% of the units are under 100. 20% of the units can be anybody who wants to buy. If you want to live in a good community, then you can buy in. And therefore, you have children. I grew up in a small town. I never paid attention to whether I was playing with the doctor's kid or the garbage man's kid. It was whether I liked the kid. When you're in a neighborhood that has full range of social economic groups and the kids are playing throughout it, their ability to see what the potential is for their lives expands, and you get a healthier environment and you get better experience for the children as well as the parents.
You said something earlier, or it might have been last time we spoke, we create our own market. What does that mean in practical terms?
So
where are the bottlenecks today? Land, capital, construction, system coordination?
Yeah, our current bottlenecks are simply twofold. One is land, with a landowner that's willing to wait till construction start to get paid. Two is seed capital to get together the pre-sales and the municipal approvals that allow us to get the financing for everybody to get paid. Those are the two impediments. The approval process is a minor impediment to us because everybody in the bureaucracy wants affordable housing and will bend over backwards to move our projects forward. So we have to have the resources to pay the architects and engineers and consultants to get us ready for construction. And we have to have the sales. 70% of our units has to be pre-sold in order to line up the financing in order to move forward with the projects on a fully financed basis.
What's the timeline for finding a site? Well, not finding a site, getting approval for a site to completion. I spoke to a guy the other day who's also based in Canada. Obviously, not a company like yours, and he was developing, social housing or affordable housing in the States, simply because he said it took him so long to get permission to complete a project here in Canada. What's the timeline like for you, and how do you get around all that?
Yeah, part of it is we're able to deal with sites that are partly through the approval process because they're partly through the approval process and they can't sell, so they're frozen. So that helps us, but still, on average, once we start on a site and people move in is 4 to 5 years. Now, having said that, working on a dozen projects at a time means that you're at all different points in the process of moving forward. We've also started to focus now on projects over 300 units, as large as a couple of thousand. Those projects are delivered in phases. So if you're delivering units every year in a subsequent phase, it doesn't feel as long anymore. So the startup period is frustrating, it takes a while, but once you're rolling, it feels like you're constantly delivering units, and that makes life a lot easier. But our goal here isn't to solve the problem ourselves. It's in order to grow to a company that does a couple of thousand units a year and instigate 10 or a dozen more doing the same. So the idea is to spread the model and our approach to more and more people who see it as valuable, and through the delivery of multiple delivery agencies, we can reach the 10 to 20,000 units a year that we're targeting.
Now, tell me, how does the process work? Obviously, you're delivering different houses at different stages in different places. If I'm someone who wants a home, can I not afford to be area sensitive? Do I have to go, if there's an area 20, 30, 40 miles away from where I was hoping, but that's the first batch of housing that comes up and I'm on a waiting list, maybe there's a waiting list that you can explain, do I have to go to that first available site?
No, we don't work with a waiting list that is prioritized. What we have is we have a website where projects that are getting close to being ready to sell allow you to sign up on a list. So you could sign up on 3 if you want to.
Right.
So it's your personal decision as to whether you choose to go further away, but we don't require you to go to the next available project. You can be considered for any project that we're doing. The trick is that we don't market formally to the public. So
Right.
You have to hear about us indirectly through the newspaper, through your local counselor. We market primarily to groups of people through HR departments or through their executive, and they send it out to their email list. We set up an information meeting to explain what people are getting involved in. They have to go out and get their mortgage clearances, then they can come to a sales presentation. At the sales presentation, which is also a group presentation, you have to decide whether you're serious enough about that site to make a $100 non-refundable deposit. That gives you access to a salesperson who can sign you up as a purchaser. The 100 is returned to you when you close on a project. It stays with us until you do so.
So your developments obviously remove a lot of traditional layers with regard to cost. You said no luxury amenities, simplified designs, minimal market spend. How much of affordability is actually cost discipline versus innovation?
We've always said that we could cut the soft costs in half, and the construction costs by 5%. So we also reduce the market value because we're providing a simpler product. So we generally generate the same 15 to 20% profit margin, but on a lower market value. So the reduction, some of it is eaten up by the reduced market value. That's roughly what we're able to do. 25% to 30% of the benefit is provided through the financing, not through structural changes to the building. Now, my experience of European housing is you're already doing a lot of the no-frills type of stuff, whereas in North America, we're still into extremely expensive finishes because it can sell for more money. So I have a lot more room when I simplify the finishes to save money than the European condition has. So what I've learned over the years is I don't go to another country as an expert. I go to another country to listen what's going on and see if I can add value after that.
So if you're cutting down, the expense, which obviously cuts down the value, how does that affect the financing when it comes to getting a mortgage?
Yeah, in terms of the financing that we're looking for construction and takeout, it's 50% loan to value.
Right.
So even though the market value is lower, you're still 50% below that, so it doesn't create a problem from that point of view. In Canada, the source of the money are important. You can only talk about loan to value if it relates to funding that's provided by government, not by nonprofits. In our case, a lot of our loans initially are coming from government. Then eventually the loans will come as cash, which counts as equity under all conditions through the model itself. So we've got a short-term plan and a long-term plan where the financing is quite different.
Okay, interesting. You structured the buyer journey as a clear pipeline: education, reservation, financing, build, ownership. It's like a systemized production model. Would you say?
Yeah. The approach is now pretty much set up as protocols, and we just apply the protocols as we move through. We also provide a much higher level of literacy training, financial literacy training as part of the process to make sure everybody understands what they're getting into, what they need to do to keep their credit rating in the right place. And then once they occupy the units, we will give them regular information bulletins in order to tell them what's coming up in the way of interest rates. How should you prepare for it? One of the most exciting things that we're trying to do is to use our nonprofit financing agency to borrow long-term money for takeout mortgages. And our goal here is to have 5 participants in a syndication that provides takeout money on 5-year terms that roll over differently for each lender. What that means for our purchasers is they will have a mortgage where the interest rate only rolls over for 20% of their interest of their mortgage, which means they'll never face a doubling of their mortgage. Whereas in Canada, the biggest problem is every 5 years your mortgage rolls over. If the interest rates are twice as high, you're in financial jeopardy. But if that only applies to 20% of your units every year, you get to prepare for the change, and the change isn't unmanageable if you're careful.
So, tell me about this. You're obviously catering for quite a vulnerable sector, the 33 to 110k they're vulnerable to maybe losing jobs, whatever. What happens when they're, in the shared equity situation and they become unemployed and struggle to get another job? Is there any backstops that can help them from the government or whatever?
We've built into our financing structure a backstop, but it's not an indefinite backstop. So if somebody is unemployed and is clearly not able to manage finding another job, then they're going to have to sell their home and take their equity and figure out what to do. But if it's a tradesperson who's been fired in one place because of lack of work, and we know that they're willing to travel the 50 miles to get the job at the next place, we'll lend them the money to make up the difference between the getting from one job to the next one. That's pretty straightforward. So we're looking to protect people's position, but we can't protect everybody's position.
That's still really, really a lot more than most entities do. So it's very, very good. You mentioned when we're talking about construction, etc., you mentioned modular and factory-based construction. How important is that to achieving scale?
At this point in time, it's not important at all because there's a lot of unemployed construction workers around. So the way that I say it is if the factory production produces a lower price, and it only has to be a few percent, then we'll go with the factory production. If it won't, we'll just build in place. In the long run, to create the scale we want, it's critical. But that's 5 years down the road.
Well, you said you operate on roughly a 1.5% project fee. How does
Correct.
that scale commercially? Who are the key participants in your ecosystem? Apart from, outside of maybe developers, agents, lenders, government, etc.
That compares in two ways. One, to other profit-making consulting firms, they would be working between 3 and 5%, generally targeting the 5%, this day and age 3%. So it's half of those. What's more interesting in comparison is that 1.5% represents what would normally be a 15% profit margin, because the profit margin is kept in the project to help people with their down payments, and then it's paid back to a different arm's length nonprofit that has to use it to build more housing. So depending on how you look at it, it's either good or crazy. And we're even a little crazier than that because we're interested in people who want to make a difference, not make a fortune. So people inside our consulting firm, the top paid person can't be paid more than 5 times the lowest paid person, which is an incredible incentive to pay your lower paid person more, because every dollar more you give them, you get 5 for yourself, right? So it's a bit of an oddity. But that dollar means more to the lower paid person than the 5 means to you. I've always said what we're obligated to do in society is get our kids out of university debt free and to make as much of a difference as we can. I love this saying that comes out of a number of indigenous groups: the more you give to people, the more you receive back.
Well, tell me, how does it work in principle? Obviously, if you're capping people's earnings, etc., how do you manage to get the best quality people that are willing to do that?
Well, remember that the top paid person would be traveling in the $180,000 to $200,000 range, which is not enormous suffering, right? But the oddity is that if you have somebody whose goal is to make $1 million a year, the way they approach servicing the public, the way they approach building their projects is different. And it creates this cycle we have of boom and bust. For somebody who's willing to take a healthy amount of money, but is primarily focused on making a difference, this model we've created can work no matter what the economic conditions. Because the 50% that we've targeted for carrying costs, if the interest rate goes up, we just move it down to 45%. And if they go down, we move it up to 55%. So the model itself can adjust to changing economic conditions. And as you know, selling to people between $35,000 and $100,000 a year, there's an infinite market. That market will always be there. We do not sell to investors. It's all owner occupants. So it's a much more stable group that we're selling to. So all of those things come out of that kind of ethical positioning. And that ethical positioning is what will protect this planet in the long run. Because needing more and more money means more and more production, which is on a finite planet and makes no logical sense. What we want to be doing is producing what people need in a format that still allows for space for the rest of the environment and the ecology on the planet so that we can live in a good environment. Being a really rich guy living in a cave, you're still a guy living in a cave, right?
One thing that's always interested me about non-profit organisations is obviously somewhere along the line you probably make a profit. What do you do with that surplus money? How do you manage it?
Yes, in fact, I have always made a surplus on every project I've ever done. The difference is that that surplus is not distributed to shareholders or individual owners of the company. It has to be recycled into the social purpose of the company. So the companies I work with often have a 2 or 3 year operating reserve to make sure that in the down times we're still paying people and we're still moving forward. So it's a different attitude towards protecting the group rather than maximizing an individual benefit, but it still needs a surplus.
So, maybe a silly question, but who owns the company?
You're going to like this. So we've got 3 different nonprofits. The one that I work for is the type of company that I've worked for the last 40 years. The board of directors, it's called a worker-controlled nonprofit. So the board of directors is composed of people that have worked at the company for at least 3 years and had positive reviews. So that means that the board of directors often represents 80% of the people who work there. And that's the companies I've been working with for 40 years. So I often tell people I've never worked for a company where my staff couldn't fire me. And if you think about the relationship that creates, I'm not allowed to say, you have to do this because I'm the boss. I'm allowed to say, this is why I think we should do this. And it gives everybody ownership of succeeding. So that's the consultancy, that's the nonprofit. The cooperative corporation I work for, that is composed of the future purchasers, have volunteer purchasers on the board who have hired us to do the day-to-day work for delivering their own homes to them. The Community Wealth Co-op, which is the overarching funding agency, is what's called a multi-stakeholder cooperative. So it has stakeholder groups within its membership for each of the different groups that are involved. So the delivery agencies, the social enterprises, the co-ops, even people who want to be involved to bring their good name to the company, indigenous groups, government. So there's multiple stakeholder groups that elect the board of directors, and the board of directors is required under their charter to reinvest their money first in housing, then other things that will improve society. So we've structured the whole thing to be vision protected going forward for multiple generations.
This is like really, for me, and I might be wrong, a pure form of socialism.
Yes, I like to call it social capitalism because it is capitalistic. It manages capital like any other business, but it is targeting the benefit, the extra wealth in capital to be returned to society. Think about this. If we had a legislation that said that 50% of all profits had to be used to protect society and protect the planet, would we be in the same problems we're in? Now, democracy will not elect that kind of government. So who cares? Government is not particularly important. It's what people decide to do. So we voluntarily decided that the majority of our profit will be set aside for the benefit of society, voluntarily through a capitalist system. So this isn't socialism because we're still businessmen, we're still using capital, we're still generating a profit. It's what we do with it that changes the result. But that result change either happens or this planet is damaged to the point where it happens anyway. So it's kind of fun to basically say government isn't critical to this. They can give us some policy help, some policy direction, but I only need 1% of the population to decide that this is a good idea. So part of your listenership that is interested, I only need 1% of them to call me and say, I'm interested and I'm on my way. I don't need 40% of the population to vote for me. It doesn't matter.
I think it's the way forward.
I think it is, but the beauty of it is, my opinion doesn't matter. It's who decides to join that matters. That's going to make the difference. I can be right and not succeed until other people
this should be run worldwide. Yeah, I really believe that. Coming on to worldwide, you said that this model can work globally, but must be implemented locally. Why is local knowledge so critical?
Yeah,
I mean, obviously we need it in the UK. So many countries need this type of operation.
I can give you a very intriguing story on that one if you have about 3 minutes. Yeah, we have 3 minutes.
Of course.
I was in Cameroon, and I was there for my first trip, and I was there to help them work on housing, and they put me in a room in a relatively small city of 200,000 people, of 20 people. And I started telling them I was there to make a difference in their economy. Any surplus that they got, they'd keep themselves. We'll take a 1% fee, and that's all we want to do. Well, it took me 4 hours of questions from all different angles before they would believe me. By then, half the people had left the room because they saw there was no money to be made. The people that were left said to me, you know, we believe you, but it isn't going to work because we're corrupt. And I said, I don't want to hear you say that again. What you have is a commission structure. And the lower level employees of government aren't paid enough to take care of their families. They want to receive a little extra money to make the difference. Everybody knows how much that is. You can plan in your budget, you can work it through. I have no way of understanding that commission structure. So I have no business working in their country. I can only help them understand how to create the housing, finance the housing, use the benefits for their society moving forward. And then I said to them, but let me tell you about my commission structure. I work in such and such a city in Canada, and there's only enough work for the planners for there to be 3 jobs, and there's 7 planners. So when I go in for approvals, they come up with 100 things wrong, so they have a lot of meetings to fill up their timesheet. That costs my purchasers $20,000 a piece. That's our commission structure. I said, which commission structure would you like? You guys can get a building permit in 2 months. Nobody in Africa wants our commission structure. So it's all about perception. You know, a commission structure is a commission structure. We're no better or worse than the situation in Africa. But local people in each jurisdiction understand what's going on. So I only work in partnership with local people because local people understand. So I pass on knowledge, some good, some bad, but always generally useful. But I don't work in someone else's space.
Moving on to scalability then, globally or whatever, how much could you scale before the system breaks?
As I say, we can go to 1,000 or 2,000 units a year. If we tried to go further, we would have too many people in the office, it would get too hard to run, it would start to undermine. But when you have a proper accreditation process for delivery agencies, Canada could use 50 delivery agencies and it wouldn't break, because we have the financial institution to oversee the entire operation. The system doesn't break. The system slows down when you don't have enough financing. So the situation in Africa is they don't have access to proper financing. If we could find proper financing for Africa, which is on my list of things to do, we could start producing 2 or 3 million units a year across the continent. That would create, in their case, 15 million jobs. We could completely change the economy of Africa by using housing as the tool, through access to proper credit. That would prevent the displacement that's coming from climate change in Africa, and we could save 25 million lives. Thus, the reason I can't retire.
That is unbelievable.
It is
that is unbelievable.
And you know how I learned that? 10 trips to Africa and the willingness to just listen.
A very special role you play. if we, we're almost done, but if we look 10 to 15 years out, how do you see things progressing from your standpoint?
If things work correctly, there'll be 20 to 24 delivery agencies in Canada, and we may have 3 or 4 in the States. I'd love there to be a couple in the UK, but that's dependent on people in the UK to decide they're interested. But I definitely want to go back to Africa and start the work that's involved. I think that it's very real that we could borrow $1 billion from the UK and the European Union to provide the opportunity to provide housing construction in Africa. The money would be a loan, not a grant, it'd be a loan, and we would set up training facilities on the shores of the Mediterranean to train construction workers to send them back to Africa rather than across the Mediterranean. I know I can raise the money for that as soon as I have enough credibility.
That's amazing. For listeners basically that want to learn more, for people maybe globally but want to get involved, and I'm sure because this is a global audience, where can they get in touch with you? How can they learn more? I think obviously knowledge about this is so important. There's not enough people aware that this really exists.
Yeah, you have my email. For somebody who can write quickly, it's M as in Mike, Labbe as spelt on the screen, and then homeopportunities.ca. And as best I can, I'm willing to virtually talk to anybody who wants to make a difference rather than just focus on making money.
Are you on LinkedIn?
I am on LinkedIn as well, as Michelle.
Okay, great. All right, well, I want to thank you, Mike, for this conversation. I think, it's a very apt conversation. People need to be thinking about this more. We live in a very volatile society. People need this type of service.
Let me just quickly say that I've heard 2 interviews now of people that say that the increasing violence in schools is because of the stress that is caused by people who aren't properly housed. And so the lack of housing that people can afford when they're paying 56% of their income towards their housing is producing such stress that it bleeds out into the rest of society. And that's why we're living in more difficult times, is that people are more stressed than they used to be. Mental health is going up. All that stuff comes from not having a proper place to live.
I agree with you. I think the stress of living nowadays is phenomenal. The living is going through the roof.
Exactly, which old folks don't have to experience, but I really feel sorry for my kids, right? When they look at their future, it's completely different unless I am successful at what I'm doing.
I agree. All right, well, thank you very much, Mike. I really appreciate it. Thank you, listeners, for listening in. Any questions, you know where to get hold of Mike. I'm Gary from A1 Solutions International, finished with INTL on the end.com. You can catch me anywhere on LinkedIn, all the social media pages, YouTube. I look forward to talking to you all again. And Mike, thanks very much for attending. You've been a great guest.
No worries. My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Bye now.